It's an election year, so that means it's time to talk about one thing: voter suppression. And Now This News, along with the Emerson Project, released a video titled "How Americans' Votes Are Being Blocked in 2020."
A growing number of states are trying to make it harder for a lot of us to be able to have our voices heard in our elections. But why would anyone want to stop eligible citizens from voting?
Spoiler alert, no one is doing that.
Unfortunately, the U.S. has a long and troubled history with voter suppression. Let's not forget that women didn't get the right to vote for a long time.
When women weren't allowed to vote, they were not voters. So technically, that's not voter suppression.
African Americans faced systemic voter suppression in much of the country until the civil rights laws in the 1960s.
And if you know anything about the history of suppressing the African American vote, you'd know that it was the Democrats.
We sat down with an expert on voters' rights, attorney Mark Elias, to help us understand it all.
Mark Elias is the chair of the political law practice at Perkins Coie, whose clients include the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the Democratic National Committee. Elias also represented the 2016 presidential campaign of Hillary Clinton and was the one that retained Fusion GPS to do Oppo research for the Clinton campaign, who were the ones responsible for the Steele dossier. It's safe to say that Mark Elias might have an agenda.
Let's start with young people and college students. A number of states have put restrictions on voting that particularly impact young voters and college students. Some states have closed polling locations on or near college campuses, made college IDs an ineligible form of photo ID, and more.
Even though this is YouTube and you can make a video for as long as you want, Now This News didn't take the time to provide any real detail here. What I found is that these 13 states in the map they presented do not allow college IDs to be used when voting in person and/or when registering to vote. And that's because college IDs vary in quality, and non-citizens from foreign countries also receive college IDs when they attend colleges here. Also, when I was 18, I had an ID from a university that I wasn't even attending, so there's always room for fraud.
There are states that have said in order for a mail ballot to count, or an absentee ballot to count, there needs to be a street address.
But when you register to vote, you need to include your home address and/or mailing address.
I went to Hamilton College for 4 years. I don't even know there is a street address. I certainly don't know what the hell the street address was for my dorm.
You never thought of asking? What did you think your address was? Mark Elias at Hamilton College? Come on.
And as a result, they throw out large numbers of ballots that are cast by students without full street addresses.
So if a dumb student fills out a form wrong and it's not accepted, that's voter suppression. It's ridiculous. As for the earlier claim regarding closing polling locations on or near college campuses, the only example that I found was in this New York Times article that reports that Austin Community College had set up temporary early voting sites on 9 of its 11 campuses. But Texas requires that these sites have to remain open for the entire 12-day early voting period, and since these were temporary sites, they did not meet that standard. The students were not kept from voting, as they could go to an early voting site off campus to cast their vote. So no, the youth are not being voter suppressed.
Another group often targeted by voter restriction laws are Latinx and Hispanic voters. One way state legislatures are targeting these voters is with voter purging.
So voter purging is the removal of names of people who are registered to vote from the voter rolls.
This is not voter purging. This is upkeep. The law simply ensures integrity of the voter rolls, and there is nothing nefarious about it.
Unfortunately, in the last few years, and particularly in the last few months, we have seen Republicans in Georgia and elsewhere take advantage of these laws and really do aggressive purging.
First of all, the law that Republicans in Georgia are taking advantage of was passed in 1997 by Democrats when they controlled the state legislature and the governor's office. But it's only an issue when a black Democrat runs for governor in a red state. Second, the Georgians who were removed from the voter rolls hadn't voted in an election for 7 consecutive years and did not answer correspondence from the state that would confirm that they still lived at their address. The only voter suppression here is by the registered voters who won't go and vote.
28 states use a program called the Interstate Voter Registration, or Crosscheck for short. That program incorrectly flagged voters with the same first and last name and date of birth living in different states as duplicate voters that should be purged from their lists.
So if a Juan Rodriguez in Iowa with the same birth date matches a Juan Rodriguez in New Jersey, those 2 names are put on a potential duplicate registrant list. So while those voters were flagged, they were likely not purged, which is why Judah Robinson said,
duplicate voters that should be purged from their lists,
as opposed to voters who were purged from the list. Allow me to explain. A paper published in 2017 found that Crosscheck's proposed purging strategies would have eliminated 300 registrations out of 124 million names that appeared on the potential duplicate registrant list. So just because there was a match did not mean that a voter was removed from the rolls.
But according to the US Census, people of color, including Latinx people, overrepresent 85 of 100 most common last names in America, which means they were more likely to be added to a state's removal list than white voters.
Now he's talking about the US Census, which has nothing to do with statistics from Crosscheck.
In just December 2019, the ACLU of Kansas announced a settlement that would suspend the program for the, quote, foreseeable future.
But suspending the program has nothing to do with racism. It was suspended while they implement security upgrades and adopt industry standard encryption practices. Once they make those changes, Crosscheck will be back up and running.
Another way Latinx and Hispanic voters are being targeted is by a new wave of mail-in voter restrictions.
We're currently suing Arizona. Arizona passed a law to make it a felony for anyone to collect and deliver to the county or to the mailbox a absentee ballot that isn't their own.
Elias is referring to Arizona House Bill 2023 that states that unless you're a postal worker, family member, household member, or caregiver, that it's against the law to collect and deliver someone's ballot to the post office.
About 70% of Arizonans vote by mail. And in the more rural counties, the counties that have large Native American populations and have large rural Latinx populations, you have even higher than 70% rates of vote by mail. You have long distances to mailboxes.
The argument by the DNC is that these rural populations have less access to post offices and outgoing mailboxes.
So the communities had self-organized themselves so that people would fill out their absentee ballots, seal them, and then bring them to a community center, and then someone would then drive them to the nearest post office or county office.
However, it's more common for representatives of political campaigns or political parties to be collecting these ballots. For example, back in 2014, ballot collectors affiliated with the Arizona Democratic Party collected a couple thousand ballots. And in 2016, representatives of Basta Arpaio, a grassroots migrant organization, collected ballots from the Latino community in an effort to oust Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And you may remember that back in 2017, GOP operative Leslie McCrae Dallas was indicted along with 7 alleged co-conspirators for a scheme that included improperly mailing in absentee ballots for someone who had not mailed it themselves. So when Republicans do it, it's rigging elections. But when Democrats do it, it's completely on the up and up and cannot be questioned. Anyway, the Arizona Democratic Party had sued Arizona over the ban on ballot collection. And eventually, the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals blocked the law. But the next day, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that decision and upheld the law because a similar lawsuit brought on by the DNC against Arizona was still being considered. In January 2020, the 9th Circuit ruled in favor of the DNC, stating that Arizona had violated the Voting Rights Act by banning ballot harvesting. And that means that this case will be heading to the Supreme Court. We'll keep an eye on it.
Voter ID laws. About 2/3 of states, or 35 in total, currently have some form of voter identification laws on the books. Some states require a photo ID, while others require non-photo forms of identification, like a social security card or a birth certificate. On the surface, these laws sound like common sense requirements to be able to cast your ballot.
Yes, they are completely common sense.
The GOP says they're only trying to fight voter fraud, which is extremely rare.
Which is extremely rare because there are laws and policies in place specifically designed to stem voter fraud.
Maybe you've even heard an argument like this.
You know what? In this state, you have to show a photo ID to buy Sudafed. Yet something as important to our system and way of life as voting, you don't have to even show a photo ID. This only makes sense.
But that actually doesn't make a lot of sense, because buying Sudafed isn't a constitutionally guaranteed right, but voting is.
But you also need a photo ID to get a job, collect government benefits, drive a vehicle, buy alcohol and cigarettes, and board a plane. And when I last checked, none of those things are constitutionally guaranteed rights either.
And these laws, of course, disproportionately disenfranchise African American voters. Various surveys estimate that as many as 25% of African Americans don't have a government-issued ID, but about 90% of white Americans do.
The statistic that 25% of African Americans don't have a government-issued ID is widely cited, but where does it come from? It comes from a survey from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU that was conducted over a 3-day period in 2006. And the sample size was 987 randomly selected people of voting age. And for some reason, the Brennan Center for Justice has never done a follow-up survey. But outfits such as NowThis News have no problem using a 14-year-old survey with a sample size of less than 1,000 people simply because it meets their narrative that African Americans are being suppressed.
Another way African Americans are having their access to voting suppressed is by limiting access to early weekend voting. In the 2008 election, 54% of African Americans in Florida and 35% in Georgia casted their ballots at early voting sites.
Cast, not casted.
Casted their ballots at early voting sites.
Well, it turns out that African Americans in particular make heavier use of weekend early voting than the general population as a whole.
There are only a few states that require the polls be open on Sundays during early voting. Early voting in itself is a convenience. It's practically a luxury. You won't allow me to vote on the weekend? Damn you, voter suppression!
The Black church is a very important institution, particularly in the South. And so very oftentimes the church serves as a centerpiece for making sure people are registered and are participating in the political process. Many of those communities have come to rely on weekend voting, particularly Sunday afternoon voting, but even Saturday voting.
First, if you're a member of a church, you should know that Sunday is the Lord's Day. It's not very godly to expect other people to work at hundreds of polling places on the Sabbath. And if you're in Georgia, while you can't vote on Sundays, the state offers 19 days of early voting. In Florida, there are 9 days of early voting, including on Sundays. So where is the suppression? Look, all you need to do to not be a victim of something that doesn't exist is to make sure that you're registered in time, have your ID ready, and most importantly, actually get off your ass and show up to the polls to vote. You'll be glad you did. Anyway, thanks for watching, sharing, and hitting that like button. Be sure to follow me on Twitter for updates so you'll know what's going on if my channel disappears. So cross your fingers for me. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel while you can. And as always, thanks for all the support, everybody, and I hope to see you next time.